Helene Starks, co-director of the Graduate Certificate in Palliative Care. And today I get to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart because I started my research career studying advanced directives and advanced care planning. And today I plan to walk you through kind of the history of how it is we've come to where we are today and where we're going next. So this is going to be a three-part talk. The first one is going to be a pretty quick tour of 60 years of history. From there, just to sort of ground you in that context of where we've come from and why we're doing the work we are. I want to shift us towards some more pragmatic resources, give you a little tip about language, and share some tools that we will invite you to try yourself. So I want to start by saying that, before there was palliative care, a lot of this work was done in the bioethics world, and that is where I'm from. And the reason for it is that the rationale behind advanced directives and advanced care plannings really lies in this notion of the principle of autonomy and self-determination. And the idea is that we have the right to determine what happens to our bodies, and we have the right to accept or refuse treatments. And so when we try to think about, how do we communicate what our goals and preferences are going to be for a future state when we perhaps cannot speak for ourselves, what are the mechanisms that we can invoke to protect those rights when we will be at our most vulnerable? So historically, really, there's sort of been two approaches to this. One is to come at it from the rights side. And in that regard, it is trying to think about, what can we do to uphold our rights to self-determination? The other side is really thinking about that life guides us more by values, and that it's important that we understand sort of what's behind our preferences so that we are clear about how and what we're actually striving for when we express them. So when we think about, okay, these are the two ways in which we might think about how to protect our autonomy and self-determination in a future state, what do we do next? Well, it started in the law, not surprisingly, but as far back as 1914, when Judge Benjamin Cardozo ruled in a case that this is essentially establishing the precedent that people have the right to refuse treatments. So when we move forward to where we are today, we really see that there's kind of this intersection where the rights aspect and the laws sort of created the history that led us to advanced directives, which were essentially a document that could be produced as evidence to say that at a point in time when I was thinking about my future, these were my wishes, and please follow them in the future should you need to rely on some evidence of what my thought was at this time. The other side was really though thinking that it's very hard to capture all of the future complexity with a single document. And so there has been an evolution towards more values-based or goals-based, where we're really trying to understand what is the outcome we're striving for and what are the values that drive our preferences for treatment. And so this is where we sort of moved from advanced directives to advanced care planning. In both cases, what we're trying to do is create some documentation that allows us to have a record of what you were thinking and kind of why you were thinking. And when we think about this, how it played out in the right side in the early days, the advanced directives actually took two forms, and they kind of capture both halves of this. One being the directive to physician, which was a statement of preference, and the other being a durable power of attorney, which was, advocating that you find a person who can speak for you, who knows you well, who has seen you over time, and who can actually understand how to implement your values because you've had your own shared decision making throughout the life together. So this is the foundation, and now let me trace you through sort of how it is that we got to be where we are today. We've actually been going at this for about 60 years, and the first 30 or so, we're really focusing on laws and policies. And really, at that time, if you want to think about the early 60s, there was a time of social movements of all kinds. The civil rights movements were happening. There was a lot of change in the environment. And then in 1965 is the introduction of Medicare and Medicaid, which starts to level the playing field and sort of making access to healthcare much broader, and particularly for vulnerable older adults, and also offering life-sustaining treatments at a more population level than ever. So the expansion of these medical care choices led some people to start to worry about, well, wait a minute, what if we don't want those things? How do I go about asserting my right to say no, especially when I can't speak for myself? So this was sort of the sentiment of the day, and then there were three really important cases that came forward in the courts. Karen Ann Quinlan in 75, Nancy Cruzan in 83, and Terry Schiavo in 90. And all three were young women who had been in accidents or had a substance overdose, found themselves in a permanent vegetative state on life support, and their families petitioned to have those treatments removed. And first cases were around mechanical ventilation, and then later tube feeding. And ultimately, the families won. The treatments were withdrawn, and all three women died. But what it meant was this was a turmoil time when there was no real guidance about how to express your preferences for not wanting future care. And in 1976, the California state passed the Natural Death Act, and this became the first evidence of the language that became codified. So this was what it said: if at any time I should be diagnosed in writing to be in a terminal condition by the attending physician or in a permanent unconscious condition by two physicians, and where the application of life-sustaining treatment would serve only to artificially prolong the process of my dying, I direct that such treatment be withheld or withdrawn, and that I be permitted to die naturally. So there's a lot going on in that paragraph. First, it's really trying to demonstrate that there is evidence that you're not going to live either way, whether we continue treatment or not. And if this is truly the case, if you're at that end stage of life, then this is permission to stop all treatments and let me die. It's a beautiful sentiment, but as people began to spend the next 10 years trying to make sense of how to implement this, that vague language, that very broad language, became incredibly problematic. And it led to a lot of people saying, wait a minute, this is not enough information for us to actually use this as a guide for treatment decisions. In some cases, it aligns, but there are many, many more cases of people with serious illness who are vulnerable and need some guidance around treatment. And this statement is just far too broad to help. So what happens next is that in 1990, the Patient Self-Determination Act is passed, because we're also now trying to get some of these ideas about advance directives to disseminate to the larger public. The Patient Self-Determination Act mandates that everybody who's admitted to a hospital or to other healthcare setting be offered the opportunity to complete an advance directive so that they know what their rights are. So we're still sort of in this idea of we're asserting rights, and now we're disseminating to the broad public that you have these rights and you can go ahead and complete an advance directive if you like. You can imagine, though, that for someone who's coming in for what seems like a routine hospitalization, to be told that they can fill out an advance directive is awkward, and it becomes kind of a checklist thing that loses meaning and is not exactly advancing the cause. So we come to the beginning where we're shifting away from this idea of a single document that's very broad and very vague, towards start to thinking about how is it that we engage with this topic in such a way that we can communicate both values and preferences and start to introduce something that is a little more concrete and specific for action, especially for clinicians who are in an emergency situation and are trying to figure out what the right thing to do is next. So along this time, the post paradigm comes into being. This is the introduction of medical orders or physician order for life-sustaining treatment. And it takes it away from this broad preference statement to an actionable order. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. But following along this, where it's really trying to give specific guidance about how to act, as well as combined value statements, we start to see a lot more consumer-oriented products to give people guides on how to talk about this stuff. So 1996, 5 Wishes is introduced in Florida. They've been around for a very long time. They're still going. CAPC starts in 1999. For the next 10 years or so, there's all kinds of new organizations that are coming into existence through Vital Talk, the Conversation Project, Ariadne Labs, Serious Illness Conversation Guide, Prepare for Your Care, the Hello Game. I'll talk about all of these in a minute. 2016, we start our graduate certificate program, as are there others around the country that are starting this. And everyone is now sort of thinking, how is it that we can be teaching these communication skills and the sort of evolution of process to help patients come to understand what their choices ought to be and how to continue to talk about them in a way that guides care. Last but not least, it's important to note that the policy landscape has been busy this whole time, and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services have also been adapting the environment. A big complaint was that no one could get paid for these conversations, either in the hospital or another setting. That changed with the introduction of the billing codes in 2016. A caveat was they were only free for people who were on an annual Medicare wellness visit, and everyone else was paying a copay. That is set to change in 2024, where that copay is now going to be waived. So you can see it's been a lot going on. That was a very quick tour. To summarize, though, I think this is kind of where the field has settled on thinking that there are stages of advanced care planning that kind of can be applied across the lifespan. Many advocate that at age 18, when you assume majority, just as you assume the responsibility to vote, you could consider naming a surrogate decision maker, because the person who might be defaulting to make decisions for you as you become an adult could easily change as you emancipate and perhaps get a partner, get married. And so these are ways in which it's important to sort of take on those big life prevention kinds of things by saying, wow, if something happened to me, who would speak for me, and what are my sort of big picture preferences? And you might complete an advance directive just to indicate that in the event of trauma or injury or sudden loss of consciousness or something like that. But really, we're sort of thinking about all of the things that we are doing in this course, and as we start to think about more tailored conversations for people who are living with serious illness, is where we sort of step in and sort of think about these serious illness conversations that we've been practicing in our course. This might also be as you get closer to the end of life, when you would think specifically about completing a POST. POST forms are really meant to be specific to someone who is in an emergency situation, and you really would be responding to them in kind of a life and death way, not really meant as a general preference. And then for final end of life decisions, we might have even more specific conversations about afterlife planning, funeral planning, any religious ceremonies, things like that. So this inverted triangle is kind of representing the population and sort of how we think about who we might be engaging with. And the reason this is super helpful is you can kind of think about, well, where do your patients fit in this continuum from sort of mostly healthy, aging well, more prevention, thinking about estate planning, broad statements in case of an emergency, to more specific preferences and goals of care as people get sicker and closer to death. So that wraps up our history side. And now I'm going to transition us to share a lesson about language. And this one is important because it's a little bit about making sure that you are using these words correctly. There's a common mistake I want to highlight here, and that is there is no D in advance directive. So I think what happens is somewhere along the way, people heard advance directive and they put a D. So it became advanced directive. And that's actually a mistake because when we're talking about an advanced directive, what we're saying is that I'm thinking about my future now. I'm planning in advance for a situation that's coming. That's different than we're thinking about advanced when directive, where we're thinking advanced as in not a beginner state. So when we think about the advanced directive, it's really on those big picture preferences. When we're thinking about advanced directives, that's really kind of where we're talking about the serious illness guide and onwards, where we're getting very specific about the care plan. And those are absolutely important documents, but they're not the same as the legal advanced directive. All right, moving on. I'm going to take us through another quick introduction to some of the tools. These will all be part of your assignment to go and check them out. We're going to ask you to explore around, and if you've used any of them, that's great. But if you haven't, we're going to invite you to try something new just so that you can see what else is out there. Maybe thinking about where your patients are on that continuum from pretty healthy to near the end of life. So when we're thinking about advanced care planning, there's sort of these buckets where resources have divided themselves. And one is around materials that sort of help get conversations started, from those that can happen in a community setting amongst peers or with an advanced care planning facilitator of some kind, to tools that you might be using in a clinical one-on-one or in a family meeting where you're really trying to explore values and goals of care. So I'm going to start there, and then we'll make a quick tour through all of these by the time we're done. So starting with the advanced care planning conversations, I'm going to open us with a nod to common practice and the Hello game. You might have played or heard of this game in its previous iteration when it was called My Gift of Grace. It's really a little booklet. Everybody gets a little booklet, and they get 6 gratitude chips, and people can play this game in multiple ways. Each person can read a page and share what they've written. Everyone can flip to a page and write for a few minutes, and then the whole circle can share. And the gratitude chips are shared when you hear somebody else's story that really moves you for whatever reason. You can pass your gratitude chip to them. The end of the game, the one with the most gratitude chips wins, and everybody wins because they shared all the love. It's a great game. There's a lot of guides that you can either use for like a tea party, or if they've used them in conventions, they've done them from 2 and 3 people to 60 and more. It's online, and it's a really fun game. The next is from the Conversation Project. This was started by Ellen Goodman, who is a journalist, and in some ways this was really in response to 2009, when Sarah Palin introduced the idea of death panels that were going to be part of the Affordable Care Act. It was really scaring people into not wanting this, thinking that, if you turn over all these controls to your physicians, pretty soon they're going to be making your end-of-life decisions without telling you. So in some ways, this was a pivotal moment to sort of reignite the community engagement level. And the Conversation Project started. It was originally connected up with the Ariadne Labs. It has since joined for the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. So it is very much a thing, and it's a really excellent resource full of a lot of very pragmatic tools and guides, starting with some good questions kind of along the Hello game about sort of where would you sit on some life issues, big life issues, like who would you want to represent you? What would there be situations that would, describe your quality of life? So they're really getting you to sort of get in the headspace, and then they offer a step-by-step conversation guide. They also have these great videos, and in the interest of time, I'm only going to play a quick little snippet. And I'm going to start in the beginning, and then I'm going to fast forward you to the end. It's a little bit of a good, better kind of video. So these kind of go through several different kinds of awkward moments, and then we transition to kind of the better version. So these, there's several other in the library. They have a bunch of them. Some of them are really funny. Some of them are very practical. They're showing a real family meeting with somebody's birthday party and having everybody share their preferences. They're really great just as conversation starters, which is exactly what they're intended to do. So next, I want to shift towards advanced care planning tools. And this one's a little of a overlap between some of these conversation guides, as well as ones that include some specific advanced directives. Some of them are more packets where you get a little bit of everything. So these categories are a little mushy here. But I'm going to start with the Serious Illness Conversation Guide, which was developed by the Ariadne Labs in around 2012, I want to say, 10, 12. And over time has become adopted and shared with many other national organizations that are disseminating communication tools like VitalTalk, CAPC, and Honoring Choices Pacific Northwest, as well as the Honoring Choices program, which is sort of a next generation from what began as the Gunderson Health Program, became Respecting Choices, and now is Honoring Choices, which is community-based advanced care planning endeavors. The checklist was really meant, it was introduced by Atul Gawande, who was really interested in sort of quality through checklists. And if you can protocolize a way to do something, then you can make it routine and easy and practiced and expert. So the protocol you'll be playing with a little bit in the next week or so. And it makes a lot of sense as a conversation guide. You're kind of setting up your conversation. You're sort of assessing where people are at in that conversation. You share some information back and forth about, would it be okay if we talk about this now? And to ask, what are your hopes and concerns? Explore those things and then bring the conversation to a close. So it's a structure that allows a conversation to happen kind of led by almost anyone on the team and almost at any stage of illness or an interaction with someone, and can work from early goals of care to advanced goals of care conversations. And there's a lot of great resources that go along with sort of how to use this, how to introduce it, and those will be shared with the link for this resource. Another one is produced by Rebecca Sidori at UCSF. She did this work after having done extensive research to kind of take all the pieces of the advanced care planning process apart and really think, what does it mean to engage someone from the beginning of getting over the hurdle of not wanting to talk about those issues to actually producing an actionable directive. What was really great about this is they involved a lot of folks who were really interested in health literacy and were trying to target this for low health literacy groups, non-English speakers, and people who had limited English proficiencies. There's a lot of mix and sort of the authors of the videos. So they have different kinds of folks on video, so you can kind of find a peer group and listen to their story about what advanced care planning is and kind of how it works for them. The site has been updated and now currently has also all kinds of legal advanced directive forms on it, including powers of attorney and living wills that are more detailed. So the evolution of the living will is that the directive to physician has now evolved so that a lot of this goals of care language is beginning to work its way into that document. So it's not just a broad statement, but it's also more specific guidance. And that's true for many of these documents, not just the Prepare for Care, but they've done a really excellent job on this one. So similarly, thinking about, who's done work around the advanced directives, probably Five Wishes is the one that really got us started by thinking about how to include some value statements that are pretty broad, but also fairly useful. And this continues to be a really popular document. It's in all the states. It's got the directive forms that are baked into it. So if you complete one of these and file it with your healthcare system, it will be honored. It's been translated into 27 languages in Braille. People can buy it in bulk. You can download one at a time. And it has become a really popular tool and recently has merged with another organization. These organizations are sort of coming together and merging with new ones as sort of people in the tech world adopt the old school versions, but there's still great utility in the content. And the brand has a great deal of reputation and following, so they continue to be active. With that, I'm going to switch a little bit from sort of these written directives and talk a little bit about powers of attorney. The power of attorney is also called a healthcare proxy or a healthcare agent, a surrogate decision maker. A durable power of attorney for healthcare particularly is a legal document that empowers another person with the authority to make decisions on your behalf. And in the absence of a power of attorney, so if you don't have one, the state has established this hierarchy because you kind of need to know who to turn to who would be next in line to sort of serve as your advocate in the absence of a formal legal document. So the first is the highest order, which is a guardian appointed by the state. And that is typically in situations of extreme vulnerability or unbefriendedness, meaning there is no one to advocate, or there is a custody issue, or perhaps a cognitive capacity to represent oneself, and a worry that they may not be having people around them who are advocating in their best interest. Guardians are rare, and but they trump all else. So then, absent the state taking over that level of authority, it's up to you to decide who you want to speak for yourself, and that's what an advance directive power of attorney will do for you. If you don't complete that, then it sort of follows the kinship rules that make sense in a society where we rely on our next of kin for all kinds of responsibilities, including this decision-making authority. So your spouse or registered domestic partner, an unregistered domestic partner may not have the privileges. So if you don't have that kind of a relationship, and you would not be able to demonstrate that you have some legal affiliation with the person who can't speak for themselves, you would need a power of attorney under those circumstances to be able to clearly make decisions for them. Absence of your intimate partners, it's then adult children. If you're a child, it's your parents. After that, your siblings or your grandchildren, nieces and nephews, aunts and uncles. Some close friends, but note for many whose family are their close friends, they would not have any authority except as an advisory person who can tell you something about the individual. So these are all the reasons why you may want to encourage someone to complete a power of attorney if this default would not work in their best interest or reflect kind of what they are looking for or hoping for as an advocate. Almost all the states have the same criteria that you need to be of legal age, so 18 or older. They're looking for conflicts of interest, so you cannot appoint somebody who's involved with making decisions about your care. And they take that pretty far in terms of like ward clerks and whatnot. So there's a lot of institutions that have trouble getting a cosigner or a witness because you can't ask anyone who's an employee of the healthcare organization to be a witness because of conflict of interest. On the plus side, what you're really looking for is someone who knows you well enough and has actually, understood what your goals and values are so they can represent you. You can do the empty chair because you know what that person would say. And they understand what they're being asked to do, and they're able and willing to do it, and that they will follow your lead even if they don't agree with what you are doing, but they will, put your interests first and advocate for them. And be willing to do that when the decisions that are being made are going to be very stressful and likely affecting them as well. So those are the reasons why we want to think carefully about who we're appointing and not do it lightly. Also, there was research done there. People were appointed as a power of attorney and never told until something came up. So make sure that you're advising them to have good conversations so they are well informed about how to enact their role as an advocate. Moving on, I'm going to introduce you to some sort of high-level resources. This one from the VA and the next one are both really comprehensive resources that sort of touch on all of it. This webpage represents about 20 years of work, led in many ways by my colleague Bob Perlman, with whom I did my research for over 20 years. And it has a lot of great resources. So if anyone that you work with or is in the VA system, make sure they know about this, because it's got everything they need that would make their decisions hold within the VA system and beyond. And then similarly, End of Life Washington started out as Compassion and Choices many, many years ago, and has since become a fairly independent organization on its own. But really their mission is to advocate for all kinds of options at the end of life, including medical aid in dying. But their section on advance directives is incredibly comprehensive. Some people say their directives are too detailed, but if that is the level of control or interest you're trying to assert in terms of specificity, this is a great resource. It also includes a wide variety of audiences. So thinking about subgroups of LGBTQI groups, folks where you may have some specific interests that you want to put forward, is a great resource. Next, another one that I want to call out is the Advance Directive for Dementia. This was developed by my colleague Barak Gaster, who's an internist and geriatrician at the Roosevelt Center here at UW. He was realizing that he's counseling a lot of families who are facing dementia, and they just needed a different way to talk about it, because the idea is that it's going to be one size fits all as dementia advances. Your preferences might change depending on the stage of dementia, and also a way to sort of explain how dementia changes over time and kind of what's at stake as someone advances more toward the end stages. So first articulates what mild, moderate, and dementia are, so that people can kind of see where their loved ones are, which group it looks like this person has, and they may or may not still have capacity to express preferences. And then it is a little of this menu where you're trying to think about, well, if I had mild dementia, I would feel this way. If I had moderate or severe dementia, I might feel another way. So the idea is that you can pick different goals to live as long as I could, and then you could talk about what is the level of care, and that could work for whatever it is you're trying to communicate here. It's more broad brush, kind of a mix between value statements and directive to physician. But Barack has found it to be very useful because it's simple enough for everyone to grasp the concept, and it seems that folks with dementia can kind of follow along to some extent, or that family members can use this as a tool while they still have capacity to talk. So that was a quick whirlwind through directives. There's a lot of resources there. There's also a National Organization for Advanced Directives if you need to find some very specific state level things. Google will work fine to find you the resources that you need for your local. Would also recommend that you consider looking to see what your hospital or healthcare system has for directives. Some of them are already embedded in the EHR, so good to familiarize yourself with those. I'm assuming many of you already know all these things, just reiterating good common knowledge. So lastly, we're going to end with a quick tour of the POST form, also known as a MOST or MOLST or POST. The idea being that it is some kind of an order for life-sustaining treatment, so moving the authority and kind of responsibility for enacting the decisions to the clinician side, so that the notion is that if I know what your goals are, then it's on me to implement a plan of care that aligns with those goals, including offering or withholding things like cardiopulmonary resuscitation. So many of you have probably seen this form. This is the front page. I'm going to go into it in more detail, but the goal of it really, and its origin story, was that emergency medical technicians were responding to folks who had arrests in the community. And if they had an advance directive, even somebody brought that out and said, though they didn't want this, that wasn't enough specificity to protect the EMTs from a liability of a wrongful death. So the POLST was essentially designed in part to give those folks the permissions and the legal protections to be able to do that. It also made it very clear what you were supposed to do about CPR. So the practice has been, on admission to a hospital or out in the community, is CPR a yes or a no question? And that was more easily operationalized with a DNR in a hospital, but there wasn't a mechanism to support it in the community, and this one's what it does. The other is that because it's a standardized form and because it's a medical order, there are ways in which it is taken more seriously than a general advance directive, because it represents that a conversation has been had where these decisions were actually contextualized to the local state of the person, to the current state, and their actual risk for death. So if somebody has advanced cancer, you're going to recommend against CPR because they will not receive a lot of benefit from it. And that is a very different thing than, if something broad should happen, don't start my heart. So it's really meant to be in the context, as I said earlier, of serious illness, where you can talk about the actual risks and benefits in realistic terms given the person's presenting condition. So it's really a two-part form, front and back. The first part is really focusing very specifically on CPR yes, no as kind of the skip pattern. If yes, then the idea is you should be also articulating that you want full treatment. because the full treatment is going to be in alignment with that goal. And this is a shorthand for emergency situation. So yes, CPR, yes, full treatment. Part of this, though, is to offer the option of a no, so that if you don't want that, you also are indicating then what would be the level of care that we would be appropriate as the next step. And so selective treatment is really meant to be something that is like a time trial, or something that is perhaps less invasive but worth the quality of life trade-off, like antibiotics. Otherwise, comfort-focused care is really what they're talking about, where they're talking about maybe don't transfer to the hospital, don't begin CPR, don't do intubations or other things. There is a piece on the second page, sorry, on the back page, where they used to have all of these details about other kinds of things like artificial hydration, nutrition, dialysis, transfusions. It got to be too confusing, and they decided that it was better to put it off in its own section as something to consider. But particularly the issues around food raised such a conundrum, because some take that not as a treatment and others consider it same as any other treatment, like IV antibiotics, IV nutrition, sort of the same. So it is now over here as kind of an addendum. And that's an important part to note, because you have a spot here under additional orders to make that very specific. It also demonstrates that you're aligning these details with the person's condition. So the only other part here is just a reminder that the signatures are really important, and without them, this does no standing as a legal document. So making sure that that was done. And then this last part about who it was discussed with is sort of a reminder that there may be multiple parties who would be in a position to be in on this decision. And so this is a way to almost take role of who was there during this conversation, so you have an understanding of who witnessed this conversation or was part of it coming together. So where a post in some ways has suffered from many of the same things that an advance directive, which is sort of everybody's getting one, it's very casual, there's a lot of errors, people don't seem to be completing them correctly, they aren't signing them correctly. When we're taking that approach as it's a legal document, there are many who have worked very hard to not make it be so routinized that it's not useful. But when done and done well, can be an incredibly helpful document, especially if the people overall engaged trust it to represent the patient's wishes. It can speed things up because it has it's operationalized sort of a shared language for being able to interpret these sometimes very difficult and big situations. So with that, we are at the end of this talk, and I just want to thank you all for listening. I hope you've learned something, and that you will be enjoying your exploration of these tools and how to use them in different situations. Thanks very much.